The challenge in immigration is to find some way not to inflict gratuitous cruelties, and yet to arrive at the non-binary intermediate position that both gets the country the numbers and the talent it needs while avoiding the problems of social instability.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Monk.
Two things are true at the same time. The first is that Donald Trump is inflicting terrible damage on the United States and the world. Getting him out of office in 2020 needs to be the highest priority to any Democrat, capital D or small d. At the same time, the reasons why somebody like Donald Trump could get elected in the first place has deep causes. We need to make a lot of economic and other changes in this country in order to make sure that somebody like Trump doesn't get elected again. And this means winning in 2020 on an agenda that actually improves this country in a fundamental way. Now, the fact that these two narratives are both partially true can help to explain some of the rancor in the Democratic debates. To moderates like, say, Joe Biden, it is very hard to understand why people on the left of the party want to prioritize proving the radical bona fides over getting Trump out of the White House. Meanwhile, people on the left of the party are claiming that they will only win against Trump and that they will only be able to carry out the kind of changes the country needs if they run on a deeply progressive agenda. Well, I think both sides in this debate are half right and half wrong. Here's how I see it. Number one, there's actually a lot of support for a range of progressive policies in this country. A majority of Americans think that we should have universal health insurance. A majority of people in this country want it to become easier to unionize. They want higher minimum wages. They want higher taxes on the rich. So it is possible to run on a proudly progressive agenda that is appealing to most Americans. Number two, there are also some real limits on the kinds of politics that can win in the United States. While most Americans are for some form of universal health insurance, for Medicare for all who want it, as some people have put it, they do not want private insurance to be abolished, which is unsurprising because a majority of adults in the United States have private insurance, and a huge majority of those who have private insurance say that they are happy with the quality of care and the coverage that they receive. The same is true when it comes to capitalism and socialism. Most Americans have a positive view of capitalism. Most Americans have a negative view of socialism. Most importantly, the number of Americans who have both a negative view of capitalism and a positive view of socialism is very, very low, only about 17%. So some of the things that candidates are saying, like Pete Buttigieg, like Bernie Sanders, that it doesn't matter if they label us a socialist, because Republicans always label Democrats socialists. So who cares? Simply doesn't make sense. Yes, Barack Obama was called a socialist all of the time by Fox News, but the attack didn't stick because Obama did a lot to make sure that average Americans didn't believe it. This is how he won 2 victories. So what do Democrats have to do? Well, I'm sorry if it sounds really simple, but they should run on some of the progressive policies that would amount to very significant change, which are highly popular. But they also need to ensure that they stay away from policies that have the capacity of turning people away from Democrats, of making them feel that voting for a Democrat is an unsafe choice for their own interests. Some of this may sound incoherent. It may sound as though these different preferences are at cross purposes. I actually don't think they are. Americans like capitalism. They like free enterprise. They also feel that the current system is rigged, that we live in a form of crony capitalism. So instead of promising to abolish capitalism, political candidates should be promising to make sure that we take on crony capitalism, making sure that everybody finally has to play by the same rules. That is the core of a winning economic message. For Democrats, that's what they need to both defeat Donald Trump and be able to affect real political change. Now, I really look forward to sharing with you a conversation I had with David Frum about 2 months ago. So bear in mind that we had this conversation a little while ago, and unfortunately there is something slightly funny going on with the audio this time round. I don't know whether it's a radio playing in the background or some interference from a cell phone. Please just slog through that, because I promise you the conversation is worth it. David Frum has been involved in American politics for a long time. He is a conservative who served in senior roles under the George W. Bush White House, but he is also one of the most prominent and eloquent and insightful of the Never Trumpers. He has written very important pieces in The Atlantic for the last few years, and we have a wide range of conversations about what it means to be a conservative today, the ways in which he has changed his mind or has not changed his mind over the last few years. Did he leave movement conservatism, or did movement conservatism leave him? We debate his highly discussed and controversial cover story for The Atlantic on immigration. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be here with you again.
So before we started recording, you said you're interested in talking about how you became less conservative when you got older. And I was wondering whether you've become less conservative as you've gotten older, or whether conservatives have become more radical, more extreme, on one reading more conservative and another reading less conservative.
Yes.
As you've gotten older.
Well, there is a strange conceit, and I think it's especially powerful on the political right, where people feel it a great virtue to say, I've never changed my mind about anything. And maybe I'm sensitive to this, because recently I was in a kind of Twitter dispute in which people accused me of having changed my mind on a lot of things, as if they'd scored some harsh point. And I have, over my life, changed my mind on a lot of things. I've made sort of a point of writing reasons when I have, not in every case, but in most cases, just because I think, I don't assume that people are interested, but I think you sort of owe an explanation if anyone asks.
Right.
But yes, there are things I've changed my mind about.
So are these principles you've changed your mind about, or simply, and one of the things you obviously changed your mind about is the wisdom of the Iraq War, but that seems not necessarily a change of principle, it may be a change of your expectations of what would happen. Having been disconfirmed, you think that in retrospect, clearly it was a bad idea.
First, that's stronger than I would put it. I am not so sure in retrospect that it was a bad idea, because we don't know what's behind door number 2. We don't know what Iraq would have looked like without the Iraq War. And I imagine that without the Iraq War, there would have been a Syria-like bloodbath in Iraq when Saddam Hussein's grip slackened. I mean, you would have saved American lives and American treasure. I don't know you would have had more regional stability or a better outcome for Iraqis without the Iraq War. But here's, I think, the most important thing I've had to rethink. So I graduated from college in 1982, and I entered the adult political world soon thereafter. For the next quarter of a century, we had one of the longest periods of economic stability in the history of the developed world. From 1982 until 2008, there's one recession, and a pretty mild one. Actually, I should say there are 2 recessions, both very mild. One in the early 90s, one at the beginning of the 2000s. The 1990s was more severe in my native Canada than it is in the United States, but around much of the world, it was a quarter century of few recessions and no inflation. And while the economic rewards to working people were not always as fast growing in that quarter century as they'd been in the previous quarter century, it certainly looked like we had cracked the big economic problems. And my basic view of my politics was that The conservatism that I adhere to was an answer to the problems of the 1970s that was tested in the crisis between 1979 and 1982, and that proved successful, and that was delivering stability, good government, an answer to the big problems of how you run society, and was massively vindicated by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one of the things I believed was there would be no major internally generated shocks to the system ever again.
So this is in a way Gordon Brown's famous line from the 2000s that we have mastered the economy.
We haven't mastered the how do we deliver a better living for everybody. We have lots of problems. In politics, any one solution means you now get the right to solve new problems. But the big problems that the conservatives of 1980, the Thatchers, the Reagans said, we have answers, where Carter and the British Labour Party and Social Democrats, they have problems, we have answers. That for a quarter century seemed to hold true. And so for me, the events of 2007, 8, 9, the financial crisis and the economic shock that followed, they were very shattering kind of events to my whole worldview. And they really forced me to do a big rethink about my ideas about the role of the state and the need for social insurance.
So what is some of that change consistent? What kinds of policies would you have dismissed out of hand 10 or 15 years ago, which you now favor?
I now think we need a social insurance state that doesn't rely very much on individual initiative. So I was very interested, for example, in moving from traditional government-funded pensions to some kind of forced savings program. Forced savings have a role as a way to supplement them. I just think you need to have a guarantee that when people get old, the state's going to give them something.
The problem with it is simply that if the degree of your comfort in old age depends on having been prudent with your money, if being able to go on holiday if you're in old age depends on the size of your 401k, that's perfectly fine.
Yes.
But there will be some people who are, quote unquote, imprudent, or in the terms of my very boring PhD dissertation, irresponsible, who don't live up to 1980s, 1990s notions of personal responsibility. And then the question becomes, what do we do with them? And I think the idea of a 90-year-old starving in the streets because they, quote unquote, fail to live up to their personal responsibility simply isn't tenable.
There's a wonderful line from an old Tammany Hall boss that gets quoted a lot in the history books. I forget now who said it. But the boss said that in every ward, there has to be someone that you can go to, no matter what you've done, and get help. None of your damned law and justice, mind you, but help. And that, I think he was thinking about if you've committed a crime, so I don't endorse that. But that kind of basic level. And I became very interested in healthcare provision, and it became clear. I mean, it's obvious in 2008, it's not true that capitalist economies have solved the problem of how do we avoid major crises. We have not solved that problem. And since we haven't, that all the lessons we learned in the 1930s, all of those institutions which look so obsolete from the point of view of 1985, from the point of view of 2015 and after, there's some wisdom there that we have to incorporate.
So how do you fuse those different beliefs? You clearly have a long-standing appreciation of free enterprise and capital markets and so on, and at the same time recognize the importance of those forms of solidarity which are unconditional. What kind of politics does that combination of instincts result in?
I'm conservative enough that I don't think of it as an expression of solidarity.
I see. This is I smuggled a left-wing term in. Thank you very much.
Not that I'm objecting to that. It's just that's not the way I would think about it. I would think about it as social insurance, that we just need to know, no matter what happens, people are not going to go hungry. No matter what happens.
Sorry to butt in there, but why is that not a form of social solidarity? I mean, why is it that we feel that? Why is it that we feel if our neighbor who's 90